The idea of a conservative stance in politics emerged during the French Revolution, when Anglo-Irish statesman Edmund Burke recoiled from what was happening on the other side of the English Channel. As revolutionaries in France abolished the traditional hierarchies of government and the church, Burke took a stand against radical change driven by the people trying to make the government enforce a specific ideology. Ideologically driven government was radical and dangerous, he thought, because the ideology quickly became more important than the reality of the way society and people actually worked. In 1790, Burke argued that the role of government was not to impose a worldview, but rather to promote stability, and that lawmakers could achieve that stability most effectively by supporting traditional structures, social hierarchies, the church, property, the family. Conservative meant, literally, conserving what was already there without reference to an ideology. Those in charge of government should make changes slowly, according to facts on the ground, in order to keep the country stable. This idea almost meant that government could be a positive force in society rather than a negative one. That conservative political identity did not translate particularly well to America, where, because leaders were still creating the new government out of whole cloth, there was nothing long-standing to conserve. Until the 1840s, the word rarely appeared in the political realm, and when it did, it referred to someone who rejected the radical ideas of abolitionists, who wanted to end human enslavement, or of women's rights activists who wanted to give women the right to vote. The word conservative began to take on specific political meaning in the U.S. when anti-slavery Northerners refused to honor the Fugitive Slave Act that was part of the Compromise of 1850. That law required federal officials, including those in free states, to return to the South anyone a white enslaver claimed was his property. Black Americans could not testify in their own defense, and anyone helping a runaway could be imprisoned for 6 months and fined $1,000, which was about 3 years' income at that time. Enslavers and their Democratic colleagues began to call those speaking out against the Fugitive Slave Act radicals because they rejected a law. Charges of radicalism spread more widely 4 years later when Northerners of all parties organized against the 1854 Kansas-Nebraska Act, under which Congress allowed the spread of slavery into lands that had in 30 years been set aside for free labor. In December 1855, Democratic President Franklin Pierce used his annual message to Congress to accuse Americans who opposed the spread of slavery of trying to overturn American traditions. He described the United States as a white man's republic and claimed that the founders had believed in a hierarchy of races in which free white men ruled over the subject races, Indian and African. I got another book about that. Jump over to Caste real quick. The Origins of Our Discontents by Isabel Wilkerson. In the winter of 1959, after leading the Montgomery bus boycott that arose from the arrest of Rosa Parks, and before the trials and triumphs to come, Martin Luther King Jr. and his wife, Coretta, landed in India, in the city then known as Bombay, to visit the land of Mohandas Gandhi, the father of nonviolent protest. They were covered in garlands upon arrival, and King told reporters, quote, "To other countries I may go as a tourist, but to India I come as a pilgrim," end quote. He had long dreamt of going to India, and they stayed an entire month. At the invitation of Prime Minister Nehru, King wanted to see for himself the place whose fight for freedom from British rule had inspired his fight for justice in America. He wanted to see the so-called untouchables, the lowest caste in the ancient Indian caste system, whom he had read of and had sympathy for, but who had still been left behind after India gained its independence the decade before. He discovered that people in India had been following the trials of his own oppressed people in America, knew of the bus boycott he had led. Wherever he went, the people on the streets of Bombay and Delhi crowded around him for an autograph. One afternoon, King and his wife journeyed to the southern tip of the country, to the city of Trivandrum, in the state of Kerala. They visited with high school students whose families had been untouchables. The principal made the introduction, quote, "Young people, I would like to present to you a fellow untouchable from the United States of America," end quote. King was floored. He had not expected that term to be applied to him. He was, in fact, put off by it at first. He had flown in from another continent, had dined with the Prime Minister. He did not see the connection, did not see what the Indian caste system had to do directly with him, did not immediately see why the lowest caste people in India would view him, an American Negro, and a distinguished visitor as low caste like themselves. See him as one of them. Quote, "For a moment," he wrote, "I was a bit shocked and peeved that I would be referred to as an untouchable," end quote. Then he began to think about the reality of the lives of the people he was fighting for. 20 million people consigned to the lowest rank in America for centuries. Quote, "Still smothering in an airtight cage of poverty." Yes, I am an untouchable, and every Negro in the United States of America is an untouchable, end quote. In that moment, he realized that the land of the free had imposed a caste system not unlike the caste system of India, and that he had lived under that system all of his life. It was what lay beneath the forces he was fighting in America. What Martin Luther King Jr. recognized about his country that day had begun long before the ancestors of our ancestors had taken their first breaths. More than a century and a half before the American Revolution, a human hierarchy had evolved on the contested soil of what would become the United States. A concept of birthright, the temptation of entitled expansion that would set in motion the world's first democracy and, with it, a ranking of human value and usage. It would twist the minds of men as greed and self-reverence eclipsed human conscience to take land and human bodies that the conquering men convinced themselves they had a right to. If they were to convert this wilderness and civilize it to their liking, they decided they would need to conquer, enslave, or remove the people already on it, and transport those they deemed lesser beings to tame and work the land to extract the wealth that lay in the rich soil and shorelines. To justify their plans, they took pre-existing notions of their own centrality, reinforced by their self-interested interpretation of the Bible, and created a hierarchy of who could do what, who could own what, who was on top and who was on the bottom, and who was in between. There emerged a ladder of humanity, global in nature as the upper rung people descend from Europe, with rungs inside that designation, the English Protestants at the very top, as their guns and resources would ultimately prevail in the bloody fight over Northern America. Everyone else would rank in descending order on the basis of their proximity to those deemed most superior. The ranking would continue downward until one arrived at the very bottom. African captives transported to build the new world and to serve the victors for all their days, one generation after the next for 12 generations. There developed a caste system based upon what people looked like, an internalized ranking, unspoken, unnamed, unacknowledged by everyday citizens, even as they go about their lives adhering to it and acting upon it subconsciously to this day. Just as the studs and joists and beams that form the infrastructure of a building are not visible to those who live in it, so it is with caste. Its very invisibility is what gives it power and longevity, and though it may move in and out of consciousness, though it may flare and reassert itself in times of upheaval and recede in times of relative calm, it is an ever-present through line in the country's operation. Caste is not a term often applied to the United States. It is considered the language of India or feudal Europe, but some anthropologists and scholars of race in America have made use of the terms for decades. Before the modern era, one of the earliest Americans to take up the idea of caste was the antebellum abolitionist and U.S. Senator Charles Sumner, as he fought against segregation in the North. Quote, "The separation of children in the public schools of Boston on account of color or race is the nature of caste, and on this account is a violation of equality," end quote. He quoted a fellow humanitarian, quote, Caste makes distinctions where God has made none. End quote.